be your MC for the evening. My name is Miles Francisco. I use he and his pronouns. I'm a senior here at OU. I'm a student organizer, student activist with Uprooting and Rising, which is a food justice organization here in Norman and also on OU's campus. We work to envision a future of food sovereignty. So I appreciate all of you for coming and to all of our panelists. This event was put on by the Sustainability Committee of Undergraduate Student Congress, as well as Uprooting and Rising Norman and Student Environmental Coalition. This event was funded by CAC Speakers Bureau, Student Alumni Association, Student Affairs, and SGA. So now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Demalda Newsome. Ms. Newsome has come all the way from Mississippi, so we really appreciate her joining us this evening. She has spent a lifetime fighting for justice in the food system in Oklahoma as well as Mississippi, and was gracious enough to come to tell us about it tonight. Please join me in welcoming Demalda Newsome to the podium.
Okay. Good evening. First of all, I want to thank Gina and the Uproot and Rising group that invited me to be here at this session. I really appreciate it. And I want to, first of all, in any session that I'm involved with that deals with food justice or anything with the land, the water, or the people, I want to give honor to the people that originally owned this particular land that we stand on now, and that's the Muscogee tribe. So I want to give honor to them. I also want to give, because this is their ancestral land, and I want to be respectful of that. Also, I want to give honor to the Creator that brought all of this together, to my ancestors and your ancestors that helped to make this great country what it is. And I want to describe to you a little bit about some of the things that I've been involved with here as far as food justice. When I first started my work here in Oklahoma, there were a lack of things. Originally been living in Tulsa for 34 years. There were no grocery stores in the area of where we live, and that was in North Tulsa. They have grocery stores, but the food was really old food, not healthy looking, not, there was no social consciousness in the types of food that people were able to buy there. So one of the things I looked at is that we need to, make it available, healthy, nutritious food to everyone. It's not that people in those low-income communities that they don't want to be healthy, but it's a lack of access to being able to get healthy foods. Transportation is an issue. There's a lack of funds for the transportation system that's there. And also, being able to buy vehicles and those kind of things, because there's a lack of jobs. So you can't get to a job if you don't have transportation. So one of the things is we started a farmer's market on our actual property, and we made it we created a teaching farm where community members could come in and they could use small plots of land, or either they could come and sell the things that they were growing in their own property. So we didn't charge any fees to them. We were actually the only farmers market on an actual farm in the history of statehood. And as far as I know, there's never been another one that's actually been on a farm. And then there was an issue with people that were having, that had children to be able to access healthy vegetables. And what I found out was across the country they were doing the WIC farmers market vouchers and the SNAP program, which is previously known as the food stamp program. But Oklahoma wasn't able to get that. And one of the reasons was after me going, from the regional office, in Dallas, and even taking a trip on my own dime to DC, sitting in the office, insisting that someone in the ag department tell me why Oklahoma is not part of this program, and only to find out later from an anonymous phone call from the state that they were not interested in it because it made Oklahoma seem more of a poverty state. And we were already like number 2 in hunger in the U.S. And they thought to create more healthy foods for low-income people would make them look more poverty-like. So eventually, when the stock market crashed and it became a problem for white people to access those kinds of things, then it was a problem. So lo and behold, now we have it. We have the farmers market WIC and the farmers market SNAP program, So now here's some, I have partnered with Leah Penniman, and she is a farmer in the New York area, and she's written a book that's like the #1 seller. I ran into her through some of my working in the food justice sphere. So Leah just wrote this book, and it's like the #1 seller. And anyone that's interested in food justice or any kind of environmental justice, land justice, water justice, this is a one go-to tool. So I'm going to be using a lot of her work. She was really kind enough to share the slides with us. Some of the slides are from her community. And then this other book, this one is called Farming While Black. And it teaches you and talks to you about, food apartheid, food deserts. And what she described as food apartheid is that food desert kind of gives you the notion that it's a natural phenomenon, like people not having these things. It's just something that naturally occurred. But what food apartheid describes is that, it's actually designed like that. When you look at the zip codes area, who gets what funding, what comes in what area, because of these different things, the health disparities, the land that was taken from people, from the black farmers as well as the indigenous people. These lands were stolen lands and yet never returned back. So she talks about, too, how white allies can look at what's going on and be able to be a intricate part of fixing this system that has been broken. So she gives a lot of examples and organizations for white involvement in this movement. Okay, so I'm going to do a real quick slide. Okay. This is where we're saying that part of the DNA of the United States food system is involved with racism and injustices, both of them, with the genocidal land theft from the indigenous people, continue with the kidnapping of black people from the shores of West Africa for forced agricultural labor. That's 300 years of forced labor, of free labor, that the United States was built on. And also, I'm trying to do it fast, and the exploitation of brown people as well as Asian people too that came here and that are working the land for little or no money Um, like, if one of those cars, you know, get to talk about the CIW workers and how little money that they're paid, and also there's one about the children that are working, the Latina children that are working in the fields that are poisoned, where some of them are describing that their skin is falling off. And this is happening now. This is not something that happened years ago, but these are some things that are happening now. I was reading one of the articles where 100 bales of cotton, these farmers were only given $1 for 100 bales. Imagine, and this is before we had those things that were, you know, picking the cotton and sorting it. But 100 bales of cotton for $1. And if you see, my daughter-in-law has just moved to Mississippi with us, and this is her first time, because she's from Oklahoma City, and this is her first time seeing cotton in the field. And then she saw these big wheels of cotton, and she's like, this is unbelievable. I didn't know where cotton came from. Like, really comes from the ground, you know, but it was just, you know, and then you think about that 100 pounds of that, and you're only getting $1. And it's really difficult to pick, and it's prickly, where you're scarring up. I mean, you're actually getting cut and all of that as you're picking that. And the same thing with rice. The rice fields too, they're in a lot of southern states, and people, you know, getting cut up from the blades because it's the grass. So, you know, blades of grass, you know, can sharply cut you, but people still pick it. We're talking about stolen land and stolen labor. So this is by design. That's the description of food apartheid. Okay. In Africa, when they were transported in the ships, this is how all of those people were transported back to back, face to face. All those little lines are human people, African people from the different coasts of Africa, mainly West Africa. And they were all brought over here, but when they had, some of them had the sense to braid the seeds into the hair of the people that were coming. You know, some of them made it, some of them didn't. But they braided the seeds into their hair because they knew they had to eat. So even though they were getting captured, they were still thinking about how they would feed themselves whenever they got to wherever they were going to. And this is a picture in Leah's book. Her sister drew that, and that is the braiding of the seeds into the hair. So they bought rice seeds and all different kinds of seeds when they came. Here are some of the seeds that were bought. And like I said, all of this is in his books. Okay. Through colonization, there's been a lot of land loss, not just by indigenous people, but also by African Americans that lost a lot of land during these periods of time. They were like, you can see the difference here. The land ownership, if you look at that one, look at it in comparison to the Latino and Latinx people, the Asian people, the Black and the Allen Pacific. So the numbers are still high for white owners of land. Okay, and it talks about the labor that built the U.S. food system was stolen, you know, from these different people through laws that were made. There were different laws, like you talk about the Greenwood blockade. In Tulsa, there's a street called Greenwood, and that's where the race riot took place, and it was named after Greenwood, Mississippi. So a lot of people from Greenwood, Mississippi had, you know, lived there, and so that's how it got to be named that. But there was something called the Greenwood blockade, and and it was during the 60s. And what they did was they, most of the people, the African Americans, were living on lands owned by white plantation owners. And so when they tried to register to vote, they blocked them from getting any kind of food services. You know, the food stamp program was quite different back then, but still they were not able to get the food. So a lot of them ended up going north. It was a group of whites that organized themselves, and a few of them did not vote for this to happen. But if they found out that they were trying to register to vote, they were either kicked off that land, or they could not go to the local stores to get their food and their supplies that they needed. So that was another disenfranchising. Okay. And Leah talks about that too. Okay. And this is just information on the household and diabetes. So the largest number of people with diabetes are Native Americans, and mostly we look at it and think that, you know, it's because they want to be or because they're on reservation. No, it's a lot of the laws and the things that deal with the types of food that they're able to get through their programs. They're not actually healthy as they could be. It's like they're given a lesson. Now things are going on where the new administration is trying to alter the way Native Americans and their land and how they're connected to their land. Their land is very sacred, and the water is very sacred to them, and the earth as a whole. But this is something that is a serious issue that's going on through this administration, of how they're viewing it, and it's through a doctrine. I can't think of the doctrine, Roberto, but it's a doctrine that was in the early 1900s or 1800s that was designed to control the Native people. So I can't think of the doctrine. I had it written.
I think it was the Dawes Act. Are you talking about the Dawes Act?
I don't think it's a Dawes Act. It's called the doctrine of something.
The doctrine of discovery?
Yeah,
Someone said back here?
The doctrine of discovery. Yeah. It has a lot of bad implications at this point. In fact, there's a case going on now where someone that was of this tribe, the Muskogee tribe, that murdered somebody on the Muskogee land, and they're talking about that the state government had no rights to have arrested this guy because they were both Muskogee citizens, and all. In fact, they found out because there was an oversight somewhere, somebody forgot to take it out. But mostly, all of the land that's in Oklahoma is the Muskogee tribe's land. So that was one thing that this doctrine of discovery found out. So that was a challenging document. Someone went in and proved that. So his case will become federal, and that's going on right now. Okay. And we're saying that how people and the trauma of people being disconnected from their land. Like now, when we try to get African American children to grow food, you know, of course, their parents and them are saying, well, I don't want to be a slave, you know. So that trauma has been passed on from next generation, not really understanding that this is a way of liberation, of you to be able to feed yourself. You're not dependent on any food stamps or any governmental assistance to help you to be able to feed yourself, you know, in a way that you know, that gives you the freedom to do that. In fact, through my work with the state here to get the food stamp, eventually called us in and asked us about helping to craft this state guidelines for the food stamp vegetable program and the WIC program. So in that, as we're discussing, unbeknownst to everybody in the conversation, they said that when food stamps were first designed, it was designed that you could use the food stamps, the actual food stamps, to purchase vegetable growing seeds and vegetable growing plants. And no one knew that. We were all in this group like, wait, roll that back. What did you just say? I mean, like you know, because there's a whole lot of talking. But, I had them to go back and repeat that. So it was designed, but here's the thing. This is injustice. You're signing a document saying, I will get this food stamp, I will abide by these laws, and yet you don't tell the people that they can actually use them. If Walmart sells vegetable plants or vegetable, seeds, you can purchase it with the food stamp. Who knew that that was designed, part of the design of the whole program? So that was one social injustice that, that we sought to educate people, that you can grow what's called snap garden using, some of your food stamps to purchase these things. So I'm almost there because I know. Okay, so here are some of the resources. Say, if we are not acting to change the system, we are complicit, casting our silent vote to maintain the status quo. I mean, if we're not doing anything about it, if we're not part of the solution, then we're still part of the problem. And so, as you go into the different fields or whatever that you're studying, being engaged in social change that really impacts people, land, or food, because that's the one thing we all have in common. That's how the civil rights movement catapulted so far, is because of the sit-ins that dealt with the food, because one of the things is we all as human beings have to eat. And so that's what changed the movement, those sit-ins, them sitting there and saying, I have to eat. I'm back in the kitchen cooking your food, but I can't be out here eating it like that. What's the problem, So what we're saying is that I'm encouraging each and every one of you to think about your next walks in life as you graduate and go on to your professions, to think about the people that are not eating tonight. When you go to bed and you have your nice dinner and maybe steak and whatever, braised lamb or whatever, think about the people that don't have nearly anything like that or have never tasted. Because there's this rumor that people that get food stamps buy steaks and roast, they can't buy that in real time and keep it. What they're buying is crap, and it's not anything like what you and I, at these points can afford to eat.
Mm-hmm.
So so here's the contact information, and these are some ways in which you can engage in these. Is to be part of campaigns and support farmers. So here's my information, and here's Leah's information, Soul Fire Farms, and at some point, if you can, she's speaking all across the United States. Right now, she's like a hot commodity because of the things that she's promoting, is engaging all people to be part of changing the way that we access food and who gets to eat and who doesn't. So, is there anything anyone want to say? Okay.
Where you were talking about how people can purchase seeds and plants with food stamps, can they do that? Like you said that it was originally that they could do that. Could they do that like today?
Yes, you still can do it, but it has to be a place that that accepts food stamps. And
So
another
Walmart.
thing, like Walmart, I always say Walmart, Target, whatever. But it will scan, when they scan it through, and if you're using food stamp, it will take care of it. And they're called SNAP now, but I'm so used to saying food stamps.
Yeah,
That's what
that's
they
what I
were
still
back in the day. So, any other comment?
We'll have more time for questions later as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
what'd you say? Save more time later. Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you'll feel free to, contact us or join one of Leah's groups where she's speaking at. It's usually no fee, and she speaks at universities too, so that's one of the things. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Miles.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, Ms. Newsome.
Quick thing. Could we shift everything over now that the slideshow's done? Oh, okay. Never mind. Go ahead.
All right, so now I'd like to welcome the rest of our esteemed panelists for the evening. First we have Roberto Mendoza. Can everyone see him?
Well, that's what he's.
Roberto is an indigenous filmmaker and activist. Next we have Kwame Mboya. He's the founder
Mboya.
of the Mboya. Excuse me. Mboya. He's the founder of the NEOKC Farmers Market, a community educator and owner of Newberry Farm. Then we have Kent Sandman. Am I saying that? Sorry. He's an indigenous food sovereignty activist, a board member of the Muskogee Food Sovereignty Initiative, and a grower of indigenous corn varieties through the network Braiding the Sacred. And then we have Joe Hall, who is an indigenous food sovereignty activist who has played a key role in the preservation of open pollinated corn varieties and is an active member of Braiding the Sacred. And then you all just heard from Ms. Newsome. So we are now going to turn it over to discussion. So when you walked in, you saw, when you sat down, a couple of pamphlets. There's a card there with a historical happening that relates to food justice. So if you could just take some time to read that over, discuss with your neighbor or your row for about 5 minutes, just to kind of hone in on some of the things that we'll be talking about, and then we'll come back up and talk to our panelists. So just take about 5 minutes for that. 2 more minutes for conversations. Okay, thank you all so much. Hopefully, from those conversations at the end, you'll have some questions from the panelists. So now for you all's first question, we can go down the line of popcorn, whichever you all prefer, and turn on the mics or just speak. So what do you all see as the major sources of inequality in the food system? I'll start with it.
It's pretty clear to me, at least, it's not working.
You have to turn it on as a little switch.
Yes. It's pretty clear to me that the major source of inequality is the capitalist system that we all live under, and it's a worldwide system. It basically takes from ordinary people and gives to rich people. And we see that constantly where in the last 30 years since Reagan, presidents have constantly cut taxes for rich people and corporations. So now they're paying less in taxes than ordinary people. That just came out recently in the New York Times. So the system itself is designed to take money from wherever they can get it. It's usually people who have less power than them, being poorer people. And the system's values are based on greed and individualism. Greed meaning that you can take as much as you want, and you don't have to concern about whether you're taking too much. And individualism, which means that you constantly are told that you as a rich person built your corporation all by yourself, basically. It's always you that did this, not the workers that you hire and exploit, and the land that you take resources from and also exploit. So basically, to me, that's the source of inequality. It's the system itself. It's built in, based on its values. And the individualist part is constantly told, we're constantly told that we're individuals, and that that's the greatest thing about us, is that we're individuals. But it's designed to keep us from working together and coming together, because as long as we're not working together and coming together, they will stay in power. So that's why they constantly push that value.
Anyone else have thoughts on that?
I guess, did everybody hear me, or? Okay, I kind of prefer not to speak with a mic if I can. One of the things I would kind of say, especially, I'd say kind of, well, it's actually something you touched on, but specifically with the indigenous people, but also with African Americans, is the whole, it's kind of related to what Roberta was also talking about, is access to land and things like that, and water rights, those sorts of things. And that's kind of an issue because a lot of the farmlands have been concentrated in smaller and smaller hands. And kind of a related thing to that also, as I think, kind of have to remember that our agricultural system, in my view, is geared to kind of two things, really. And actually, food production is kind of a minor thing. a lot of it's actually more towards agricultural commodities. So, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, that in the Dakotas, they've spent all this money in infrastructure, and basically the soybeans are taken from the field to these railroad terminals where they're shipped to Seattle and Portland, and shipped overseas for like the market until we got the latest trade wars here, where being sent to China, where it was basically being used to produce pig feed for hogs, really, and so it was animal feed. So we've got this entire infrastructure that we just take the seeds, all the plants and all the soybeans from the farms and the fields immediately to a railroad terminal, and then they're shipped and to another, to another country. And so really that's more about an agricultural commodity export than actually producing food. And that's really kind of a lot of how the system is actually set up. I mean, when you were talking about in Mississippi about all the soybean farms that are there and being sprayed, I mean, actually, it was kind of just the amount of drift from aerial spraying of herbicides and everything affecting people who are producing actual food. And so that's something you kind of have to consider in a lot of these things too, that you really do have a system that's not set up inherently to feed people, it's to produce things for the market.
And one of the things I see that's great for, that's a problem for me is how they're trying to dismantle the indigenous people's laws, because their laws actually supersede our laws, and just watching that we have a administration that does not respect that, their water rights, their land rights, and also the migrant workers, the children that are working in the fields. The child labor laws don't always apply to them, mostly do not apply to them. So they start as young as what we're saying 4 years old in the fields with their parents, where they're either, picking apples, peas, or whatever, and they're going from place to place. And we're not talking about, necessarily undocumented people, we're talking about actual migrant workers. I tell you what, if we didn't have migrant workers, a lot of us wouldn't be eating. I mean, if we started losing them, and we are losing them because there's so much going on in the fields, the women are being raped, and nothing is being done about it because they're, not necessarily U.S. citizens or anything like that. So just the protection of the children and the women, particularly in the fields, is something that I see as a very pressing issue. I find that a problem.
Well, one thing that we really have to, and you can speak to this, the black farmer didn't have access to loans to get a lot of stuff, and also access to land. Whereas a white farmer will go here and apply for a loan through the USDA, and they got the loan, and I would go right after the white farmer, and I was denied, or I had to put up a whole lot of stuff to get access to that loan. But 1990, when the case came about,
I don't know particularly.
yeah, right, case. But anyway, it was changed. It was changed, but still we have racism and injustice as far as black people or the African American going in and just get a loan for seed or equipment and things of this nature. So that's one of the biggest injustices right there. Access to money so we can purchase the necessary stuff to form with. So we have to change that.
Yeah, I was just saying that statistic that just blows my mind is that there are more Native American farmers than there are African American farmers. And just, I mean, if you look at that in terms of the percentage of population, that's completely out of whack.
But a lot of them lost their land, especially during the civil rights movement, because the farmers were the ones that protected the people that came from the north, the students and those that rallied and petitioned for voters' rights. They protected them because they let them come on their land, and they would put trees so that the Klan and people couldn't come in on the land to kill the civil rights workers. So the only way you could get them out of jail at that time, because I guess whites hadn't thought about that, is either you had to put up cash bond or you had to put your land up. And so these farmers figured that all of these white people are coming from the north to help us, and they're putting their life on the line. The least we can do is put our land on the line. But a lot of them did lose their land through some of those things too. So it was a lot of, farmer land loss that has never been retrieved, so.
Great. So shifting gears a bit, Demalda, you talked about food apartheid and how we're moving, how many people in the food justice movement are moving away from using terms like food insecurity or food deserts and are using phrases like food apartheid, right? So with that in mind, this understanding of food apartheid, this is for you, Demalda, as well as you, Kwame. Can you tell us a bit about the food deserts in northeast Oklahoma City, as well as in North Tulsa, how they formed, and then would you characterize these areas as suffering from food apartheid?
Oh, no, first. Okay, so these terminologies, food deserts and these things, were coined by usually white people that when they looked at it, this is the way that they could see what was going on. When people of color were telling them that these things are happening, so these are some phrases that was coined, but people, communities of color that have united now in the food movement, because we all, most of the communities of color see that there's some big issues in the people that work the land and the people that receive the goods from the land. And so the apartheid is like, these are governmentally designed, how you don't put funding in certain areas, because the crime is high, and, so whatever reason and barriers that cities and places have kept these out of communities, it's all been done by different laws that were in place and that are still in place, and they're harmful to these communities. I remember living when I was in Tulsa, where there were Hmong people that were growing food in a ditch, and this is their growing practice, and one of the things is that they grow in the ditches because the water comes off of the hills and waters their plants. So, I mean, it was interesting, their system of growing. And I tell you that I've never seen such pristine growing food. Like, it's just coming out the ground. It's not sprayed or anything. There's no weeds. I was like, just in shock watching this. But the government came in and dismantled this beautiful garden that was, in next to a project, because these people were growing their food. And they made them take it all down. And it was just, it was just a beauty to the eye to see, that these people are working this land on a hill, and how, it was just beautiful. And they had to just destroy it because the government came in and said, you cannot grow on this hill. And it was public property, public land, in a ditch, nonetheless. So those are some of the things that creates this apartheid. And people that are involved with the movement, they're using these words because it's set up. It's not a natural design that these things have happened. The access of transportation and those kinds of things, it's really something that's not natural. It's created.
I did struggle with apartheid when we first assembled this together, but I reflected back on the 60s and the 50s and when South Africa was really surrogated. Then I could see the present day, and I came up with Oakland and a surrogate system too. So I think the term apartheid is really appropriate when you really look at it. Appropriate when you come from, like, our northeast sector of Oklahoma City. You probably remember about 2 months ago, we had 2 grocery stores on the northeast sector. One of them closed, right? And the food that were in those grocery stores were inferior products. So if a person comes to buy some food, it's inferior. No substance. I think we were discussing that or you know, we eat this food and stuff like that. It's supposed to be also nutritious, but yet it still doesn't have any substance to it either. I think that's in all communities. But I think it's a good term that we can use and we can really apply to really put those parallels together about the system in South Africa and what is happening in America today. Big farm buying up all the land. You know what I'm saying? So the farmer right now, if you look at the big farm versus like the family farm, almost non-existent right now. If you look back at the beginning of the turn of the 20th century, black people had all this land, farmland. Look at it right now, it's very, 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 very minimal, very few. So it's a system, it's something designed to take place with this Bird touched on it, you know, the rich and the poor, things of this nature. But it's a design system. It's a design system. So we have to, you know, you students, you're all in a perfect position to fight and revamp the system.
Exactly.
You got to organize and do it because you have still like 10 years from now, those family farms might be in non-existence. And then you have like the big corporation who put out the pesticides.
And owning the seeds.
And the seeds.
And another thing, I worked on creating a healthy corner store deal. My son and I and a group of other like-minded, they were students at the time. And so we wrote up this bill with Senator Scott, and it was passed through legislation. And what it was, it gives you $300,000 in a loan that's not hard to qualify for, with a very low interest loan by the government. There's no new monies that has to fund this. And they give you city, state, and federal tax incentives to create a healthy corner store in these communities. See, they did all that. There was a lot of hoopla around it. But what they did not advertise in the community to the people in the communities that, you know, the underserved community, that this bill even exists, or to get anybody, even from the outside, to come in and create this mall. So it still exists, as far as I know. The $300,000 loan through the Department of Ag is still there for this healthy corner store. But see, this is apartheid. You don't hear about it, you don't know about it. Most people have never heard of it. But we did this work in the, I guess, the early 2000s.
If I could ask, the folks on the live stream are saying it's hard to hear without the mics. So if y'all could try to use the mics, that would be great.
Okay.
So why is it important for everyone, for all of us, to learn how to farm, to learn how to grow our own food, and what inspired you all to teach these things?
I'm going to say that I come from a farming and ranching family. And strangely enough, I was told that all of those days were numbered and things were just going to go away. I needed to live in a city, and that was it. And once I got into my university life, in fact, I graduated from here, as you all are attending this one. I come from OU as well. I started asking myself questions, because even in my cultural activities with my own tribe, there is a phrase that you'll hear every once in a while, which is what they say, colonization. And colonization is an interesting word to me, because the idea is the colonizer comes in, and what are the first two things they take away from any people that they're going to colonize? They take away their language and they take away their food. And they usually take away whatever cultural practices they may or may not have. And that's basically the cornerstone of everything that the colonizer does. And with capitalism, capitalism is about stuff. They've got natural resources. They have land. We need to take it. How do we do that? And it's a self-replicating system. And once I kind of got my mind around that, then I got to looking at corn, which has been the staple crop of my people for at least 10,000 years. Funny thing, it comes from grass. It was bred over generations. And if you get the original varieties, not the stuff you get at a grocery store, it has some interesting characteristics. Like it can generate enough sugar to make whiskey. It can make enough alcohol to supplement gasoline. If you get the right tribal varieties, it even has as much protein as peanuts or any other tree nut that's out there. It's an amazing plant in that regard. And once I got past that, then it was, maybe this stuff needs to go on. And I think that's what I'm going to say to everybody else. If you've got a language, if you've got culture, if you've got food that you want to keep, you better do it. And that requires skills, and that requires knowledge and foresight. That's all I got to say.
Yes, I grew up in south central Oklahoma. My stepfather was a farm laborer. His family lost all their land. And my mother's family had lots of land, but we had no money to develop it. We couldn't get loans from it. So we have like 360 acres and it's just sitting there. For many years, it was just rented out to local ranchers, basically, for cattle. And then we put a stop to that, but we had never had enough money to develop a farm. So it's still sitting there. And basically, what I would like to tell people about land is that there is land in the city that you can access, sometimes through churches, sometimes through the city, through abandoned lots. And there are community gardens happening in Oklahoma City. One around 33rd and I forget the name of that little street. But it's called, I think it's called some kind of community farms. And it's been around for like over 10 years. So, and then there's others, like in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, there was a farm on school grounds. And that's quite a big little farm. So there is access to land to do community gardens in every city. In places like Detroit, where so many people moved out, and there's so much empty land, the people there are mostly African American. A lot of the elders who came from the Great Migration from the South still remember how to do their gardens. So they started doing gardens there, and they had big community gardens in Detroit, huge ones, and a lot of them. But that developed into a movement, not only about food sovereignty, but self-autonomous sovereignty in general. And they look toward the example of what's happened in Mexico with the Zapatista movements. How many people have heard of the Zapatistas? That's not too bad, but you need to look it up. Google it, Wikipedia. It's a movement that started because of farming policy. The North American Free Trade Agreement basically was going to take away these farmers that were mostly indigenous farmers in Mexico. They were going to take away their market, basically, and give all the money to rich farmers. And that's one of the reasons that so many Mexican people and people of Central America moved to the United States, because they could not survive under that new trade policy. But anyway, the people in Detroit, they call themselves the Chiapas of the North, because the Chiapas is the state where the Zapatistas started. And they had ideas about transforming the whole country. And just last year, a new movement started that is trying to transform the whole country. And it's called Symbiosis. It doesn't have a headquarters because they don't believe in centralized movements. They don't believe in the state. They believe in autonomous communities. They believe that communities should own all of the land. They don't believe in private property. They believe that the communities as a whole should own the land, not as individuals. Because the individualistic owning of private property is one of the big problems, you know, in this system of capitalism. So if a community owns all of the land that it built on, they have more control on what it's used for. And they make sure it's not used just to grow commodity crops to ship to China and to make money off of, but to grow food that actually people they can use, that need to survive. Because basically this country is falling apart. It's collapsing slowly. But we know it's collapsing because we have an idiot running our country. You know, isn't that a sign of collapse? Of course it is. So it's up to us as individuals, as communities, as people, to get together and to take over the way we govern ourselves and the way we feed ourselves, the way we educate ourselves, the way we heal ourselves. And what's happening in the example of the Zapatistas is that they have their own health centers, they have their own farms, they have their own schools, they have their own communication systems. Everything that the so-called capitalist system that we depend on now, they don't depend on it at all, except for maybe the internet. And so this new movement called Symbiosis is using those models to say that in this country, we can also do the same thing that the people in Zapatista, in Chiapas have done. Take over our basic necessities, our basic infrastructure, because the system is collapsing, and it will not too long in the future, it's not going to be able to provide the services that it currently does. Even right now, they're cutting back services, especially to poor people, and giving more and more money to rich people. So I have information about this group. I'm going to try to start a chapter in Oklahoma City, maybe eventually one in Norman also. So talk to me afterwards about this new group.
Great. So how does the fight for indigenous food sovereignty look different from the larger food sovereignty movement? What are some unique challenges and or advantages of organizing for food sovereignty within indigenous communities? And how can non-indigenous people support these efforts?
All right, yeah. Is it working?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I just kind of serendipitous. I brought something here. But actually, this is a friend of mine several years ago, Alicia Anzawa Sandler, who's a citizen band, Potawatomi, absentee Shawnee, and Kickapoo, having some discussions about some of these issues. And this is something that she wrote, and I really like this. So I think it's kind of a good thing. So this is Alicia talking about different issues. Any consideration or even mention of the thought of selling traditional foods would not only go against what I'm hoping to bring back, the knowledge, appreciation, and active relationship and reciprocity with our relatives, known as food plants. It would probably prove a hindrance in getting tribal traditionalists on board for such projects, and we need them. The cultural values of reciprocity must be restored as soon as possible. For those unfamiliar with what I'm referring to, traditional values and teachings consist of living in a reciprocal relationship with those relatives on who we depend for nourishment. This may be hard to follow, and I apologize, but the best explanation that I can do on here, so please bear with me. From a traditional viewpoint, nothing is ours for the taking. We must ask for permission from those relatives for their gifts that they provide. We must never take more than we need. We must also, in turn, make small but important offerings to them for these gifts. I can't go into what that is here, but it is a vital step in this relationship. In doing so, it is also important to know and acknowledge that one day we will give back our lives when we pass on. For when we return to the ground, our bodies will provide these relatives with nourishment. This is the reciprocal relationship that we must return to. If I'm able to make this traditional farming project a reality, it is my utmost desire to bring that understanding back to those who are disconnected from it. It is important because it is the natural order of things. Without it, we are unbalanced. There is no hierarchy. We are equally connected. If we look around, we can see that not having these values has great consequences. The destruction of our environment by taking more than we need, the taking from each other without permission, example, sexual assault. For me, it is about self-sustainability and health on an entirely different level. It is not only about restoring physical health, it is also about restoring spiritual health and wellness that we have been disconnected from. When we go to a restaurant or a grocery store, we simply offer currency or swipe a plastic card, and that relationship between the one purchasing and the relationship is between the one purchasing and the one selling. The one selling is not the one sacrificing their life for our nourishment, and therefore that relationship that should exist with our plant or animal relatives is severed, out of balance. And I think that's so it is kind of a little bit of a different way of looking at things. I would also kind of stress that, what she mentioned there at the end about our animal relatives, we tend to think about these issues in terms of agriculture, but I think in terms of indigenous food sovereignty, you're also talking about other forms of, tapping maple trees. My Cherokee friends up in northeast Oklahoma are gigging crawdads, all those sorts of things, and that all kind of leads to a whole other way of looking at the land and the landscape and what's involved there. So I think that's one way in which it looks probably a little bit different. You got anything?
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, and one of the things is too, there are cultural practices around how people receive their food. Like for instance, Africans, that are closer, that haven't come from Africa, and Native American people, they honor the land first before they even plant anything. They speak to the land, they speak to the air, they speak to the water. This is part of their cultural practices, their sovereignty around this is how they greet and meet, their food, their earth, the animals. And there are other groups that have different cultural practices. Like we had people that were Muslims that came and they would offer a prayer up before they slaughtered an animal or whatever, for food or for whatever that, sacrifice or whatever that they were doing, But that is how, and the sovereignty of that is that is what they do, and that is, we, honor and respect how they culturally approach it. So, that's my take on it.
And then how can non-indigenous people support in some of those efforts, specifically in the indigenous community?
Did I just say that?
I would say, first, get the skills. Most important of all, because so many things in regards to food production are not taught anymore. I know that in my own case, when I wanted to go out and make a garden, I was insulted by my own family for even thinking of doing it. And once I got into producing, my own food, then I was criticized for that on more than one occasion by people that I esteemed as elders even. And it was only after I did it for 15 or 20 years that finally I got a little bit of respect for it. And now, I do have one example for this. A man that I mentored with was a fellow by the name of Carl Barnes. He had his own corn preservation organization, and it was out in the Panhandle. He passed away a number of years ago. But he pretty much was open to anyone who was willing to work with him. and he single-handedly saved over 500 different varieties of Native American corn. In my tribe's case, there was an elder of my people, literally, he had one handful of seed left. And working with Carl, and along with my involvement and a lot of other folks, we got that to where, in my case, I grow about half an acre of it every year when I can. It takes everyone's involvement and their cooperation and work. It's not a singular event or for a single person, it's for everyone. It must be inclusive.
Yeah, I would like to, yeah, it takes work. It's on. All right, thank you. Often to hear when you start in a community garden or anything of this nature, say we're gonna leave it to the kids. Now, my thought about this right now, I said about a few minutes ago, you need to get involved. I'm 74, see what I'm saying? A lot of farmers are old like me, but you need to get involved. If you're gonna leave it to the kids now, if they see like mama and papa, or you guys are out there farming, what you're talking about, you can learn how to farm. Every time I go out and feel I go out there mostly every day, I learn something. I really do. So it's on you. And if your kids see that, if your children see what you are doing, then they'll follow. But you touched on it. We've got out of not farming. We need to get back into it. I graduated from Oklahoma State. Thank you. But when I went to Oklahoma State, I had an uncle. He knew I was going to be majoring in agriculture. I told him I was going to be majoring in electrical engineering. He cried. Really did. I didn't have a mentor to help me move from one place to the other. So I encourage you, as you were speaking of, we need to get back to the roots. And that is farming and not trying to, producing our own food. That's the only way we can solve this dilemma, is producing the food. But you have to do it. You have to get your hands dirty and learn from it. Get up early in the morning, get late at the nighttime, and when you're sleeping, you'll be thinking about it. What you gonna do next? And believe me, that creativity comes from your mind, that solution comes the next morning. But you are the ones that have to do it. Don't depend on the children, because you're not doing it, they won't do it. Thank you.
I'd just like to say that you don't have to do this by yourself, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You know, there are groups that are already doing this, like the group in Oklahoma City. What's the name of that group?
I can speak to that. I think you're talking about Commonwealth.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm the current veg farm manager, and we are located in Oklahoma City off of 32nd, 33rd, and Ollie, or Western Avenue is more Main Street, and so Ollie's parallel to that. So yes, it's started out as a community garden and has grown through a lot of hard work from volunteers as well as the co-founders. And you can find our website easily by just searching on Commonwealth Urban Farms. And we have open volunteer apprenticeships as well every Saturday from 9 to noon. We have garden school events, and it's open for people to come and see the farm and get involved in whatever way you can. And I can speak to some of the personal stories about the conventional versus unconventional choices. I'm no longer a student. I'm a beginning farmer. I started farming 4 years ago up in Essex, New York actually. Different climate, very different agriculture, very traditional environment up there. And learned a lot, both animal husbandry as well as vegetable farming. I grew up in Oklahoma City though, and decided that I wanted to understand the urban environment, because the system of social construct has taken us from an agricultural environment to now 80% of the population being in the urban environment. So that, to me, is still an experiment. Does that make sense for human evolution to actually be able to sustain both itself as a species, as well as taking care of the environment and other animals that are on this planet, right? So it occurred to me that, well, we should grow food where we live, because the energy it takes to transport, for one thing, unbalanced. Does that make sense? I question that. Self-care is also something that, from a system perspective, we have arrived at a point where our reliance on institutions and government is higher than our knowledge and skills. And that's a system statement. Somehow the system has to convince you that they have it solved, that you can actually spend your time watching movies and doing things that are considered leisurely pastime, which is great. Trust me, I love that. But what is not being then said is that, hey, guess what? You're not building skill sets. You don't know how to take care of yourself in fundamental ways that are actually creating a sense of disempowerment, because guess what? If you're sick, what do you do, right? If you need to take care of someone in your family, how do you do that? Do you rely on personal knowledge or the system to do that, right? These are important questions, because we can either live in knowledge and be informed and be skillful ourselves, or we can live based on fear because we don't know how to do these things. And so the choices we make in careers, in personal lifestyles, right, come from these kind of unconscious in many ways, but drives our decisions and choices. So my conventional choice as a career early on out of college was to do IT. Because the system told me that it could give me a good life, benefits, insurance, healthcare, a future in terms of savings, right? All these things they told me were important, it could provide for me. And I'm like, yeah, right? I mean, that sounds like something that I should consider. So I did IT management for 15 plus years. Got all of those things at the surface level, but I was dissatisfied. I didn't understand, how building these IT systems was really helping me personally grow as a human being, taking care of myself and my family and my communities, or any of that. I could have chosen to spend time to do that as well, but IT really sucks your time. And so I decided to walk away from that and rewire my brain and rethink what was meaningful to me. And I turned to food because I love food. And so I started working with food, and then found that I could take care of my mom, I could take care of my sister when she was sick with breast cancer, because I understood about nutrition and food and access to whole foods, not just being able to buy boxed foods, right? So these things then these threads led me to say, well, I better start learning how to grow food. My mom always grew food, but I was in the modern world, right? I can't, as a kid, I was like, no, that's not for me. But I'm like, yeah, you know what? I probably need to understand that. And so that's how I got into farming, was through navigating what was meaningful to me. And so again, self-care, you take care of yourself, you should take care of your family, you take care of your community. Then we can be useful and still be able to build institutions to take care of the larger crisis types of situations. We do need them. I'm not saying we don't need them, right? But we're not balanced now. On the balance, we need to be able to take back a lot of that knowledge, right? So I want to see a much more balanced approach to how we personally engage with institutions and organizations, balanced with how are we doing it ourselves and locally and in communities.
So this one is specifically for Kent and Joe. So why is the work of braiding the sacred so important? If y'all could just talk a bit about it. And then what is the Native American Seeds Protection Act?
Okay. First off, most of your food stocks that you get even in a grocery store generally come from plants and vegetables and fruits that have been tinkered with. Sometimes biologically, sometimes with chemistry, sometimes both. And you are getting a cocktail. You just don't know it. They don't tell you that, but you are. If you grow stuff on your own, at least for your own personal well-being, you're eating food that you've touched, you've worked with, prayed over, talked to, whatever you need to do with it. But it's stuff that you have influenced yourself, and you don't have to worry about any number of individuals, corporations, or anyone else influencing your life. Along with that, in my case, like with corn, there are so many things going at this very minute with it, even from the scientific side. There are a number of individuals growing it, especially up north in the Dakotas, where they're literally making the equivalent of 500 bushels to the acre. I know most of you don't know what a bushel is, but think of it as 1,000 pounds of grain or more. So 500 times 1,000 on 1 acre. An acre is about 208 by 208 feet. And in most cases, this grain is planted about 1 inch apart. And it is completely so lacking in nutrition, it's no better than a potato when you grind it up to make meal out of it or anything else. The historic corns, all of the traditional heirloom varieties, ancestral corns, had so much more, and they're so much better, more for you in so many different ways. And in this time when I know in my own people's case, diabetes is the #1 killer, it's directly tied to diet. And your diet is very important to you to stay alive, but also to be healthy. The old phrase is health is wealth, and that's the truth of it. Because any number of things can happen to you, but if your body is strong and you can make it, you'll see another day. And it's my firm belief that we have to protect all of these original varieties, because believe it or not, every last one of, well, even the sweet corn you buy in the grocery store is gene modified. And literally, they took an ancestral variety and crossed it or hybridized it to a point where it just doesn't produce much. It looks good. It has mass, but it does nothing for you from the metabolic standpoint. And we've gotten away from so many of those things just for the sake of commerce and for the sake of commodity crops. And, that's a specter that we're going to be dealing with until people wake up to the fact that they need to treat themselves better.
Yeah, and kind of a little bit more about, the organization, and actually Joe's kind of the one that got me involved with it. It is basically an organization specifically of Native American corn growers, and that's part of what they're actually trying to do is to preserve the old varieties. And so we have a lot of, they have meetings, regular meetings. I think it's probably, Joe said it's probably correct, it's probably more active in like the Southwest, and then actually New York area, the Northeast is actually pretty big especially in the Six Nations, are really pretty active in promoting a lot of it. And so, yeah, I mean, it is kind of working a lot. If you go on YouTube or Google it, you'll find some videos. In fact, one where the speaker is speaking in Osage at the beginning of the video, and that's Joe. So I had a meeting up there recently, and that might kind of give you a little bit of a understanding of what it's about. But it's not just preserving those varieties, but also preserving the knowledge that goes along with that. You know, and so it's a lot of it in the meetings. There's not just talking about the growing of the food, but also the whole thing about processing and how do you do it. And they tend to. The food, generally speaking, is stuff that people have in that area have actually grown or produced themselves, and that's kind of an important thing. And it is just kind of a network really kind of geared towards, within the native communities themselves, actually preserving and doing a lot of this stuff. And it's pretty, I've been impressed with a lot of the people that I've met at the meetings and some of the work that people are doing. Like I said, especially, up in New York, some really amazing stuff they're doing up there in terms of preserving the traditional varieties. And also, just as I said, not just, it kind of expands out just from farming, but also, a friend of mine and Joe's just was up in Canada and shot a moose and sent us a picture back down. So, they're really, actually, one of the meetings I was in May, they were actually serving moose. It's a little bit of a story. So we got up there and the guy said, well, what we got for breakfast this morning, we got cornmeal mush and we've got this morning moose meat. And I said, well, what's the difference between, morning moose meat and other moose meat? He says, well, at 12 o'clock it becomes lunch moose meat. So,
That's great. So last. Yes, please.
How much land do you guys have under cultivation for your native varieties?
It varies quite a bit. Because you see, one of the big problems that you have with gene-modified crops, how many of you are familiar with the Terminator gene? You are? Okay. Actually, I just got finished having a conversation with a friend of mine that was dealing with issues from it because there was one tribe in particular that had made a mistake of planting their original variety next to a field chock full of gene-modified corn. And guess what? It neutered it. And I think they got maybe half a dozen years off of, 300 or 400 plants. And those are genuine problems that exist with any of the gene-modified crops, whether they're beans, whether they're wheat, corn, or whatever, because they have a really peculiar problem associated with them. Any of you familiar with super weeds? Again. Okay. Have any of you ever witnessed what they can do to fields? Okay. I will only say this because I've witnessed it myself, and this was from a commodity grower himself. A couple of years ago, he planted a bunch of gene-modified soybeans, and an unexpected thing happened because they make many different formulations of Roundup. There's what they call Roundup, and then there's Roundup Ultra. And in some occasions, the Roundup will actually be absorbed by the weeds around it, and then the weeds become immune. And once they become immune, they replicate. And so you can get things like pigweed, ragweed. Let's see, there's another crazy, I can't think of it, smartweeds, yeah. And once they become immune, they can actually choke out an entire crop. And in this gentleman's case, his soybeans were overridden with pigweed to the point that, and I'm sure there aren't a lot of you that have been around heavy harvesting equipment or anything like that, but a combine harvester usually has a harvesting head that's about 20 to 25, 30 feet long. And usually a man in that piece of equipment can go through about 400 acres of land in less than a week. It took this gentleman 45 days. I know because I counted it. Because he'd go out in the field, plug his machine up with weeds, have to drag it out of the field, unclog it, and the best he could average was about 5 acres a day. And that was just weeds. Any number of different plants. And I found it doesn't really matter what species they are. Those genes are migrating, and they're affecting other plants regardless of their genus. It's very peculiar and kind of scary. And I've witnessed it personally. And it's gotten so bad with our counterparts up in New York. One lady in general who takes care of the corn for her tribe actually confronted the farmer that owns all of the cropland around the reservation and basically said, you know what? You're making my life very difficult. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to start growing my crops for me. And the guy said, okay. And now they have, you know, much less problems with Roundup, and their tribal food supply and their relationship with their neighbors has improved as well. And I think, you know, it's a step in the right direction, and it's more stuff that all of us should be doing.
So last question before we open it up to the audience. What can students, like many people here today, do to support and get involved in food justice activism and stay informed about many of the things you all have discussed today? And what can students and other community members do to combat white supremacy in their lives?
Main thing I would suggest is actually what has been said. Actually start doing it yourself. You know, growing, and again, I kind of stress that food isn't necessarily stuff that you've farmed or animals you've raised. There's plenty of, you go down to the, what's the park down, is Reeves, I guess, there's plenty of mulberry trees out there. If you go out in the right time of year, there's plenty of mulberries out together. So there's all sorts of other things that you can do besides just farming. But again, it is very much, I think, a hands-on thing that people need to be doing.
Well, I teach a seminar called Indigenous Values versus Capitalist Values. And I've done it quite a few places around the country. And basically, what I'm doing is I'm answering Martin Luther King's call for a radical revolution of values. He said that we have to change our values away from the capitalist system. Well, actually, he didn't say that, but that's what he meant. He didn't get a chance to really explain it clearly. He was killed a year later. So I took it on myself to look at indigenous values and capitalist values. And I came up with a seminar. And it became so clear to me that we are not going to make a revolutionary change in this country unless we change our values. And people are starting to talk about values. I even started hearing people talk about values in the last Democratic debate yesterday. Because values are the pillars, they're the foundation of what a society is. Everything is built on values. So if you're not clear on your values, you'll get confused. And if your values aren't strong, your system will collapse, which is happening right now. Because capitalist values, based on individualism, on greed, on disrespect for the earth, these kind of values created the greatest crisis in our civilization history, and that's the climate crisis. So that's coming directly out of capitalist values. So we have to change our values. We can't make a revolution without changing our values. There's a saying going around that says, to change the world, change yourself. And I add one more layer. To change the world, change yourself by changing your values. And my seminar is kind of like trying to get people to look at these values, because people aren't aware of the values that they've been raised under. And everybody's, including myself, has been raised under capitalist values. And we carry those around in our heads unconsciously, and we operate on them, especially individualism. Therefore, we can't get together. We can't trust each other. And these extreme individualist values are what Trump is constantly pushing out right now to divide people. So we have to get together to make these changes in our values. And that's why I look at these, the seminar that I'm doing is decolonizing your thinking, decolonizing your mind, which has been colonized by the capitalist system, and look at new values, which I looked at them and I realized indigenous values are almost diametrically opposed to capitalist values. Take, for example, I made a chart on the back of this paper, which I'll pass out to people who want it. And I'll just give you a quick example. Indigenous values: generosity, sharing, no hoarding. Capitalist values: greed, taking more than you need. Indigenous values: cooperation, working together. Capitalist: competition, dog eat dog. Indigenous values: community, we're all related, including plants and animals. Capitalist values: individualism, me first, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And what somebody else mentioned, indigenous values: reciprocity. If you take, you must give back in some form, not just things, but also human energy and work. And capitalist values: exploitation of people, the earth, and all living beings, taking more than you need. And as you go down the list, if anybody wants this, I can pass it out. And I do this around the country, and I can do it here in Norman if someone decides that, to invite me to do it. Because that's the first step in changing the way things are done in this country, and the way we do things as individuals is to change our values. But we cannot change our values unless we know what our values are, where they're coming from. We have to know that they're coming mainly from capitalist values, and we have to know that there's alternative values that we can replace those values with. So we can we can actually have a choice. So that's what I'm trying to do with this whole concept of changing our values.
We'll open it up to a few audience questions. If you have any, just raise your hand. I can run you over the mic. One over here.
What are the best tools that you would recommend to bringing farming and controlling the method of food production to urban areas, particularly where communities don't own the land where they live? Is that mostly going to be political action? Are there windowsill gardens? What are the best ways that communities can get into can achieve food sovereignty in areas where there isn't a lot of land for actual farming?
Now, when you said tool, immediately I thought of a tool, And the best thing you can do is go down to Walmart and get you a sharp hoe, or get a dull hoe and get a file and sharpen it. And that's all you need, really, truly. That's the tool. But everybody said the same thing. You got to be in the heart. And the biggest problem with farming is it can become addictive. It really can. So you start, man, it'll keep you up late at night time, really and truly. But for a tool, go to Walmart and get you a hoe and a file and sharpen it. That's all you need.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't own and never have owned any land. I mean, my parents have, but all the stuff that I've grown, when I've grown stuff, it's on people who actually let me. And I've even tried to pay rent and people won't let me do it. So a lot of it is actually, there's places out there, there will be people, you just kind of have to ask around, and there's somebody that'll always say, oh, sure, if you want to do that, you can follow, I should say. At least that's been my experience. So it's not, I think that the thing is, it's just asking around. There's a lot of it, as some people kind of mentioned. I mean, you know, there are definitely lots of churches and religious organizations and community organizations that are, you know, willing, if you'd ask, to let you put the stuff out there. So I think, you know, access to land is, it is an issue, but I don't know if it's quite as big as people tend to think sometimes.
We have a question back here.
Hi, thank you so much for all the information that you've given us today. So I wanted to ask, so a lot of us in this room, this information is really vital for us, but it's more so for people that are not able to come to spaces like this that need this information. How can we kind of like take it to them and kind of like reframe how they think about food and how they think about like kind of like the overarching like capitalistic system? Because a lot of times we are not conditioned to think about things like this as harming us and thinking about how our food is actually killing us unless we're in spaces like this. So how can we like take that education to communities where they're disadvantaged and aren't able to get information like this?
Oh, okay. One of the ways, I was invited to the OU campus in Tulsa, so I was able to address some of the same things that I've addressed here. And it's a matter of you maybe inviting individuals to come and doing one of your class sessions and, you know, with your instructor and talk to them about, you know, how it relates to whatever field or whatever that you're doing. Those are some of the ways to get it out to students. And of course, you all use social media. And you talk about what you just learned. Like, man, I just learned some important, you know, interesting stuff out here. And, you know, use that word. But I want, you know, to pass it on. And you all take a look at this. It's being live streamed. And I'm sure in some kind of way it'll end up with YouTube. And you can look at it. So you all use social media. Just, you know, that would be the way to do it.
Or the other thing you might consider is maybe not so much thinking of it as a formal class, but I mean just doing a meal for people, cooking stuff. I mean, we were talking about coming through food from learning, I mean cooking, and so, you know, if you offer people something to eat, they're probably going to show up. So.
I would add a little bit more to that. Once you get into growing your own food, regardless if you belong to a particular culture or to a philosophy or thought, it opens up a doorway to different places and to different ways of thinking. And once you learn how to prepare other people's food for them, other worlds can open up for you. Especially, you know, when you have to, like in the case of corn, one of the strange little bits with it that people don't talk about even amongst native folk is it's an Aztec word, nixtamalization. And that's a process basically to break down the seed coat of a lot of native corn because the complex carbohydrates inside it aren't released until you use that process. And once you do that, then your body is able to use it, unlike a store-bought variety. And once you get past that, the Cherokees make their black drink out of it when they go to pray. We Osages have this really big thing about what is referred to as corn soup, using, you know, sweet corn and pork for a meal. Many different cultures utilize their foods in different ways, and even for religious purposes. And so that brings you closer to other people and other thoughts and other mindsets.
Any other audience questions? If not, again, if we could give a round of applause for all of our panelists. Thank you all so much for sharing your wide breadth of knowledge with us this evening. Thank you to all of you for coming tonight and listening to these things. We hope that you will continue to join with us in community and, you know, fighting for food justice and rethinking our food system together.
Sorry. Two other announcements.